After retiring from UCLA, you spent hundreds of hours working with real-world educators who really didn't know all that much about the kinds of measurement procedures that are called for in today's schools. This led to your books like Modern Educational Measurement and Classroom Assessment, the book that I use in my classes, because as you noted, educators receive little formal training in educational measurement as part of their studies. Why is this important?
This is probably the most important question you'll ask me, and indeed any other interviewee that you do in this series. And the reason for that is I spent a lot of time lately thinking about our current educational situation, and not many people are happy with it. They know it's not as good as it ought to be. It's better than many people think it is, but it still could be made better. And I've analyzed, for me, the most significant reason that we have fallen behind in our schooling is that we have allowed mistakes to be made regarding educational assessment that have influenced adversely how we run our schools. For example, when the education profession simply allows the wrong kinds of tests to be used to judge the quality of schooling, to judge the quality of teachers, then as a consequence, bad decisions are made regarding schools, regarding teachers. Curricula are narrowed. Teachers spend too much time preparing kids. Teachers, administrators engage in dishonesty. All of these terrible things are happening because educators allowed the wrong kinds of tests. I mean, it's like fundamentally using the wrong kind of test to accomplish a very worthwhile mission. And that being the case, how do you change that? Well, you get the educator to be more knowledgeable regarding assessment. And this is a really tough challenge. I mean, the reason I spend a lot of time writing books at not a scholarly level, but try to communicate with regular folk, is because I want people to understand that the core constructs of educational assessment aren't that mind-numbingly numerical. They're common sense. And if they only knew what these fundamental notions are, then they'd make fewer mistakes. And the most obvious now is that we are using the wrong kinds of tests to judge the quality of schools and teachers. This is insane.
In Testing, what every parent should know about school tests, you write a primer for parents this time who want to better understand testing. What do parents also most need to understand about educational testing today?
There are fundamental notions regarding assessment. An example would be the concept of educational validity. What you're doing is you're trying to arrive at a valid interpretation about something you can't see. What the kid knows about reading or mathematics or whatever it is, you're giving a test to get this behavioral response, and you're trying to infer from that response what the kid can do. That's validity, and all it means is accuracy. Do you come up with an accurate estimate of what the kid is doing inside this skull of his? And so those are examples that parents can understand. Now, why is it important for a parent to have the notion that validity, accuracy, applies to the inference and not the test? Because if you think that a test is valid, all of a sudden that test becomes more majestic, has more power, has more certainty with it. What we want parents to realize is that when teachers make inferences about their children, those inferences, those judgments can be mistaken. And that's a really important notion. It's not a perfect test, it's an imperfect judgment. So that's an example of the kind of stuff that parents should know. I think students should know about assessment as well. It's crazy for this kind of knowledge to be used only by educators. Students' lives are going to be affected by a test, and they ought to know the fundamentals. And the fundamentals aren't that many, and they're fairly readily understandable.
What is your impression about using multiple measures along with these tests to make decisions about children and schools?
Clearly, the more evidence you have, the better the approach to decisions will be. I mean, I'm going to start a new book next week, in fact, on teacher evaluation. And the approach to evaluating teachers that I will recommend, I'm going to call something like a weighted evidence judgment. Weighted evidence judgment. What that means is that human beings make judgments about the quality of the evidence and the extent to which some evidence is more important than others, and those human judgments influence how you judge the quality of a teacher. Now, that's the same way you ought to approach the judgment about a student or anyone else. You look at all the evidence you have available, you decide which of it is compelling, you weight it, and then you arrive at your best judgment. Now, your judgment may be in error sometimes, but we're going to reduce the number of bad decisions if we use human judgment.
With the current federal policies, the way that things are going, a lot of states are using tests, now high-stakes tests, along with observational measures and teacher evaluation. And the correlations that we're finding between the test scores, the students, the aggregate test scores of a classroom, and the teacher's observational scores are very low in the 0.2, 0.3 area. Why do you think that is?
The reason, again, is attributable to assessment illiteracy and the failure to recognize that whenever you use a test and students' performances on the test to judge the caliber of a teacher's efforts or the caliber of a teaching staff's efforts at a school, whenever you do that, you must have evidence that the test is able to distinguish between well-taught and badly taught students. That is, that the test is instructionally sensitive, can tell you the difference between a kid who is well-taught and poorly taught. Now, we have no such evidence for these tests now. These tests are being used throughout the land without any evidence that they're suitable for that purpose. This is absurd. And if this would happen in any other field, whether it's plumbers or accountants, or we'd be shrieking about it. But here in education, we use these off-the-shelf tests for which we have no evidence that they distinguish between badly taught and well-taught kids. This is bizarre and reflects again on the fact that educators are willing to put up with this. They are willing to put up with this because they don't know enough about assessment.
Okay. The introduction to your book, The Truth About Testing, An Educator's Call to Action in 2001, is aptly titled, How We Arrived at This Unhappy Place. You argue that high-stakes tests are doing serious educational harm to children based on their use in most settings. Of what harm do you speak?
I believe the caliber of schooling in this country is so much less effective than it ought to be as a consequence of teachers being preoccupied with raising student scores on the wrong kinds of tests. If you think about the kinds of tests that are used in this country to judge the quality of schooling, whatever is tested by those instruments influences what goes on in classrooms. I mean, teachers are like all of us, like you, like me. We want to do well, we want to succeed, we want to perform our job properly. And as a consequence, if the way we judge the quality of schooling is my youngster's scores on these tests, I will certainly do whatever I can to raise those scores. And this is why you see often, you see curricular reductionism, where the only thing that is taught is what's on the test, or in many states where you have far too many curricular outcomes being measured, you end up with a situation in which you have teachers trying to cover everything at no depth at all, nothing stays. So there's some terrible education going on in our schools now as a simple function of using the wrong test. I really believe that the single most fixable and most harmful consequence of testing is reduced educational quality. If we fixed all of the tests, if we had really nifty-poo tests and all states used instructionally sensitive tests, and they're the kinds of tests that I would applaud, would that mean everything would be fixed in education? Of course not. But it would be a heck of a lot better. And that's what we must strive for, a heck of a lot better.
Do you think we're getting a heck of a lot better with President Obama's Race to the Top initiative?
Unfortunately, I think the aspirations of the Race to the Top initiative, while commendable, have got to be followed up with sound decisions at the next level. When the regulations for these kinds of operations are created, Much as in when we established No Child Left Behind and we didn't give guidance to states as to what kinds of tests would make the darn law work, now we have Race to the Top when we say there must be reliance on student test results to judge the quality of teachers, and yet we give insufficient guidance to states regarding how to make those tests really benefit education. Now, is this because of a malevolent administration? I think not. But it is a reflection, I think, of insufficient knowledge regarding the kinds of tests that help improve schooling. I don't think they know the difference. I think they believe that a test is a test is a test. It is clearly not.
Now, you serve on the governing board of the National Assessment and Governing Board,
yes,
right?
National Assessment and Governing
For
Board.
the NAEP. What are you doing at that level to talk about that service?
First, I am very important, so you must really recognize, and in fact...
We're interviewing you for that.
Right, and I would prefer that you call me Your Eminence whenever you have a doubt about what to say, but the National Assessment and Governing Board sets policy for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And National Assessment of Educational Progress has been in place for many, many years. It was not a test designed to influence instruction. And indeed, there are some people who think that it would be very inappropriate if it did. So fundamentally, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, is an instrument that is not suitable for improving the quality of instruction and simply serves as a kind of an external audit mechanism for other things that are going on. Do I think that this test can ever have an impact on the quality of schooling? No, I don't. When I accepted the appointment, I sent a letter to Secretary Duncan saying I would do everything I could to influence the NAEP direction without destroying its fundamental mission as a kind of a monitor. I would do everything I could to improve, have that test function to improve the quality of schooling. And I've really tried for the 2 years or so that I've been on the board. And I've come to the conclusion, Audrey, that that test can't be done.
Do you think that is the best test that we have going, the gold standard? No,
I do not at all. It's a test deliberately designed to have no instructional implications. You can't tell what to do from the test. For many years, as you may know, you only reported results at the regional level, and then only recently, relatively recently, have we had reports at the state level. Okay, so let's say you're a state that doesn't do well on NAEP. What do you do about it? Damn little. You don't know what to do about it. You don't know where the deficits are. You don't know how to move forward. And this to me is galling. So if I look to a place where improvement would be forthcoming from assessment, it wouldn't be NAEP. Now we have 2 new assessment consortia that are attempting to create tests that are designed to measure students' mastery of the Common Core state standards, and one can hope that the resulting tests there will be better. So I would look to those kinds of sources. If the people who are creating those tests are shrewd about it, they could have an impact on instructional quality. But I doubt very much whether NAEP will have much of an impact.
Speaking of formative assessment, in your book Transformative Assessment in 2008 and its sequel Transformative Assessment in Action, you clearly outline the benefits of using formative assessments in these ways. You also provide what you termed as a learning progression model to help educators use test data in formative ways. What is that? What is the progression model that educators can use?
The formative assessment process is very simple. All it involves is teachers or students using assessment data to make adjustment decisions. Not to adjust necessarily, because they may have been doing very well, but if you get the information, you're a teacher, you look at the information, you decide whether or not you need to change something, the way you're teaching something. If you're a youngster, you say, do I have to study something in a different fashion? All right, now, that's all there is to formative assessment, the use of assessment data, assessment of various kinds, to make decisions about whether adjustments need to be made. Now, if that is the case, when do you gather this information? Well, you gather this information not every day, because that's overwhelming, too much work. You don't gather it once a year. That's infrequent, doesn't fill the job. So you have to pick the moments at which you should gather the information to make the adjustment decisions. Most people who are working in formative assessment refer to the trajectory, the learning trajectory of building blocks that students must master in order to get to the final outcome. And so if, for example, you have a 1-month unit dealing with a particular cognitive skill you're trying to promote, you might identify the 2 or 3 places along the way where students are supposed to master a body of enabling knowledge or perhaps a sub-skill. And it's at that juncture, the learning trajectory says, here are the moments when you should collect information. It's at that moment that, in fact, you gather the information from which you make the adjustment decision. It's not very complicated.
And what assessments best inform that?
There can be a variety of assessments depending on the curricular aims involved. I mean, in some cases, all you're doing is literally asking the students to keep you, the teacher, informed regarding how well they're understanding something. So you have little red and green and yellow cards on their desk, and if they understand what's going on, they have a green card up, and if they get a little confused, a yellow card. And if they flop up a red there and you look out as a teacher and you see a red C, you realize whatever you're saying is not being well understood. Now, that's simply students' self-reported knowledge to you. But for a teacher, that can be very influential, and you can make up your mind about whether or not you want to change something and how you might change it. So the whole function of formative assessment is simply to supply information about consequences so you can make a judgment about how effective the means were.
And if we had to choose between the summative and the formative aspects of testing, would you say that one trumps the other in terms of importance?
No, we don't have to choose, and just because an interviewer asks you that, you don't have to do it. But they have such different functions, Audrey. I mean, ultimately, I want to judge teachers. I want to judge schooling by what happens to kids. I'm a strong fan of summatively oriented assessment. I want to see the evidence that kids have learned well, that my tax dollars have been well spent. So summative is very important to me. On the other hand, there is such an incredible array of evidence suggesting that formatively oriented use of classroom assessments can benefit children, that for us not to use them in American schools is, in my view, essentially immoral.
In general, are the tests that we are using to evaluate things like formative assessment use, are the tests that we're using to evaluate these things sensitive enough to pick up these effects, in your opinion?
The tests that we are currently using to do whatever we are doing in American schools today, in general, are not very good. Okay, start with that. Have I seen instances in which teachers can create tests that yield data from which accurate decisions can be made about adjustment decisions? Absolutely. This is doable. It's not that terrifying. I mean, think about what's happened in the field of teaching students composition. Kids can write a lot better than they could when I was a high school English teacher. They really can. Because we assess periodically their ability to write, and we monitor it, and we modify what we're doing if they're having problems with it. The whole writing process is fundamentally a series of formative appraisals of seeing how well kids can do. So it can be done, but the vast majority of tests that are out there aren't that very good. I mean, the whole interim test that we see used 3 or 4 times a year to produce evidence supposedly related to the big summative test, there's no evidence, none at all, that these tests work. And yet, American educators are spending enormous amounts of dollars and much of their instructional time in pursuit of interim assessments for which we have no evidence.
David Berliner, again, reminds us that you both believe that teachers are often not being recognized on assessment instruments for all that they accomplish and they do in their classrooms. How might we do this better?
The notion of a test's instructional sensitivity is really so crucial. If you have a test for which there is evidence that it legitimately can distinguish between a student who is well taught and badly taught, and you can collect such evidence, if you have such a test, then good teachers will quickly demonstrate that they can get students to learn what they ought to learn. And bad teachers, similarly, will not be able to so demonstrate. So if you have the right kind of tests in there, then you can make decisions not only about which teachers need to be identified as requiring more assistance and support, but also those who are really first rate will come shining through. So if you use a test that is suitable for the purpose for which the test is being employed, you'll be able to use the results of that test sensibly.
You mentioned Wyoming before. Revisit that if you would. What are you doing in the state of Wyoming that's turning out so well in terms of their assessment systems?
There was some leadership in the state of Wyoming where at the time the No Child Left Behind Act was signed into law. They recognized that this test would have an enormous impact on what happened in classrooms. And so they decided to jettison their recently completed state test and create an alternative state test which would be instructionally supportive and in time they hoped instructionally sensitive. Now, by instructionally supportive I mean that they focused on a very modest number of very significant outcomes. In reading, for example, they had only 8 big skills, K through 12, 8 big skills, and they described them very well. So the teachers in Wyoming knew that if they could just get the kids to master these 8 powerful skills, then those kids would be pretty efficient readers. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Teachers, after several years, finally got the idea, began teaching toward these powerful skills, and then they measure each of the skills with enough items on the test so you can tell whether a child has or has not mastered that particular skill, giving the teacher feedback to know this is a skill that needs more attention, or giving the teacher, the student's parents, feedback on the fact that the student needs to work harder on this skill. So you can build that kind of a test. If tests are built by people who have their instructional wits about them, you can have first-rate tests. If tests are built by measurement traditionalists, it'll be same old, same old.
Okay. What are your thoughts now about the increased emphasis on measuring growth and value added using large-scale criterion reference tests?
The value-added methodology has some serious deficits. I recently learned that you're working on a book to deal with that issue. I think it's perfectly legitimate to employ approaches to measuring students' performance that give teachers a leg up for promoting growth, even though they may not have promoted sufficient achievements to get many students up above the proficient level. And I think the work that's being done now in the state of Colorado and about 25 other states using student growth percentiles, where you're fundamentally controlling for a student's entry behavior. I mean, it works like, and you probably understand this already, but let's say you take all the kids who on last year's test scored at 37 items right, and you see on next year's test how that kid ranks in a statewide percentile. What you're looking for is to get the students you teach who came in with that level of behavior up and better than the rest of the kids in the state. And so you have a relative, that is a norm referenced if you will, comparison, but it does allow us to identify teachers who over time can consistently get more of their students, irrespective of entry behavior, up to a high level. And that's very powerful. So growth is something I think ought to be assessed, and student growth percentiles seem to me to have more promise than value-added methodologies.
Okay. In your most recent book, Unlearned Lessons, 6 Stumbling Blocks to Our School Success in 2009, you identify unlearned lessons and offer broad practical solutions that can be implemented both at the national and local levels to improve our schools. What inspired this book?
I think as you reach a point in your career where you made enough mistakes, you look back and see if there's some way to avoid them. Earlier you asked me about behavioral objectives. I mean, I was an ardent proponent of behavioral objectives. It was something that I spent every working hour promoting, and yet I made a terrible mistake. I had not realized that too many objectives essentially overwhelm educators. And yet here we have today curricula in most states that have far too many curricular aims in them. And so I see today the same mistake that we learned about and wrote about 30, 40 years ago. And so that had happened in several arenas. And so what I did is simply look back and realize that I'd made many of these mistakes, and I hate to see them remade.
And so what are your suggestions for schools that come from this book in terms of improvement?
Well, I identified 6 problems that I think, to me, are the most important ones. And if a person hasn't read them, the book, they're probably deficient on many counts, and they ought to go out and get a copy right away. It's yellow and has a nice cover. But for each of the so-called unlearned lessons, I try to suggest something that ought to be done. Just let me illustrate. One of the things that I think we've made a serious mistake about in our field is we don't routinely measure student affect, student attitudes, student values, student interests. That's the really important stuff. And you can measure these economically at the group level, not at an individual level, but at the group level. You can measure student affect very effectively. And as a consequence, if you start measuring student affect, then teachers will start doing something about making a kid like mathematics or be confident as a learner and so on. These are important kinds of dimensions. And what I suggest in the book is, with some examples, we start building these measures and routinely administering them. And so in each of the cases, each of the 6 lessons, I try to suggest what might be done.
Okay. Your extensive publishing career includes to date 30 books, 200 journal articles, 50 research reports, and 175 papers presented before research societies. Again, you are often also praised here for using a humorous writing style purposefully and engagingly, and also writing practitioner-friendly and accessible articles. You often write in Phi Delta Kappa, and is that for that purpose as well, to make sure that it gets in the hands of leaders and teachers?
If you think you have something that warrants being said, you write about it. Look, I mean, some people who'll be watching these interviews will be graduate students. As a graduate student, I thought if I got something in print, it would be read and acted on, and the world would change. This isn't the way it goes. You have to keep drumming the same bongo again and again before it reaches maybe the right person at the right time. And so what you do is you try to write stuff in an accessible fashion, in a way that's going to be read as opposed to put down after the first few paragraphs, and you hope, and that's all you can do.